Okay, so before we start chapter 2, I just want to let you all know about a protest that I'm doing with Zaka. Zaka are the organization that had the Internet Asifa protest and the Weberman protest. We're going to be protesting outside of 1146 East 9th Street in Flatbush. This outside the house of Chaim David Zweibel, the head of Aguda, and the reason why we're going to be protesting is because of Aguda's continued opposition to the Child Victims Act and their continued policy of making people ask a rabbi before they go to the authorities to report abuse. The Child Victims Act is a bill that would eliminate the statute of limitations for criminal and civil sexual abuse cases. Right now, the statute of limitations in New York is age 23. So if you're abused as a kid and you don't file suit, or you don't prosecute, go to the cops and file a claim against your abuser by the time you're 23, you can't. You can't anymore. It's cut off. So what the Child Victims Act is trying to do is to eliminate the statute of limitations so that, regardless of how much time passes, victims can still get justice for what happened to them and can still get monetary compensation if they file a civil suit so that they have money to pay for their treatment. And Aguda opposes this because they're concerned that their constituent organizations, yeshivas and stuff like that, summer camps, are going to be sued and be liable to pay millions of dollars, and some of them might go bankrupt. And they're more concerned about their institutions than they are about victims getting the money they need to get treatment following their abuse. I believe on average there are studies that indicate that it costs upwards of $1 million per victim for treatment over lifetime for sexual abuse. These are people who need therapy most, who need treatment the most, and sometimes a civil suit is the only way that they're going to be able to afford it. Not every victim has the money to pay for therapy, and therapy can be very expensive. So it's incredibly important that the civil statute of limitations is eliminated, that the criminal statute of limitations is eliminated, so that we can get sex offenders registered even after the victim turns 23. And another thing that the statute of limitations elimination would do, another thing that the Child Victims Act would do, is open up a 1-year window for past cases, so that past cases that have already passed the statute of limitations, there would be a 1-year window where victims could file a lawsuit. It wouldn't be for criminal, they couldn't file any criminal charges, but for at least for civil lawsuits, they would be able to file within this 1-year window. And if they could prove their case, then they would get to sue for monetary compensation for damages from their abusers. And again, it's very important because treatment over lifetime costs a lot of money, and a lot of victims don't have the necessary resources to pay for it themselves or access to adequate health care, and they need to pay private, and private's really expensive. So it's very important that if you support these initiatives, if you support the elimination of the statute of limitations, and you support victims having a right to sue their abusers in court so that they have the money to pay for their treatment, please come out June 25th, 1146 East 9th Street at 3 p.m. and just put a good on notice that we're not going to stand for this garbage anymore, that there are people who are watching them, that there are people who are going to hold them to account. And hopefully if they feel enough pressure, they're going to feel compelled to change their policies. So now we're going to go to chapter 2. We were discussing last week about what it was like when my mother went to the mental institution, and the circumstances that led to that in my family. So this week it's going to be about more particular about each time, like what life was like when she was decompensating and needed to go to the psych ward. Every time was the same. Each time was different. There were a couple of different threads that she would draw on when she was constructing the fabric of her particular breakdown. Each breakdown was different, and she'd draw on material from different things, that would set the tone of the breakdown, and sort of, it would look the same every time, even though it was different. There were similarities. And the common thread running through all of them was the idea that the world was fundamentally out to get her in one form or another. And it's not that she was so wrong about that. It's not that it was all conspiratorial, paranoid nonsense. Her life had been difficult, and she had been taken advantage of. It's more that she just never got over any of it. She never moved past any of it. So it would all come back when she was decompensating. And how could she have gotten over it? She had never gotten really a chance to have a life. She was married by the time she was 19, fresh out of seminary, when secular girls her age, like regular American girls or whatever, would have just been finishing up their gap years and, heading off to college, after having backpacked across Europe or whatever, people do. When other people are striking off on their own and building their own future, she was already engaged to be married. And she got married to an abusive man and had 2 children in 2 years, got a divorce, and wound up with a bipolar diagnosis. And all of this was after having been raped as a teenager, nearly raped by one of her brothers. The uncle that I mentioned in the last chapter had tried to sexually assault her. And in general, she was the black sheep of the family. So her life and her control over its trajectory pretty much ended when she got married. In a sense, she remained forever a 19-year-old trapped in an ever-aging, outwardly adult body. And there were constantly new narratives being added to this long string of ills the world and the people around her had inflicted upon her. There was a $35,000 that she claimed my grandfather stole from her. I don't remember the particulars about that, but she was always yelling about $35,000 that my grandparents had stole from her. There was the fact that, according to her, when she had broken her ankle, my grandfather hadn't taken it seriously and had told her to walk it off. There was the fact that my grandmother had custody of me and wouldn't give it up. The computer that she had spent a month's worth of money buying for me, which had died after I insisted that we update to Windows XP. There was a boyfriend that she had when I was young who had helped raise me for a while but had left her, who she was always pining after. The admittedly horrible insults my grandfather had periodically leveled at her for being the way she was, among a whole laundry list of other seemingly less significant slights. There was a lot of stuff that she had pent-up resentment for, and they would come out when she would decompensate. She held on to each one like they were all she had, like it was her case against humanity, an oral history of her grievances, both sword and shield in her fight against the world. But by far the biggest was the truth about my father. My family was confronted by a pretty serious problem when I was born. My mother had been married, and I didn't seem to be the child of her husband. She swore up and down that she, hadn't had sex with her husband, that, I was the son of the other guy. Her husband knew that. He knew that they hadn't been having sex. So everybody knew that it wasn't his kid. And I stood to be labeled a mamzer, which would ruin my future. I'd be relegated to the trash heaps of every shadchan. I'd fit only to marry other mamzerim or converts, and shadchanim do not treat either kindly, mamzerim or converts. My family went to their family rabbi and asked him to, take up the case, to decide the case, and declare me, one way or the other. It was decided that I wasn't a mamzer based on several halachic technicalities. Basically, it's actually very difficult to create a mamzer. Even if the parents both say that they did not have sex with each other, and the mother says that she had sex with the guy, you still need witnesses who have to have seen them have yichud, and there weren't any witnesses. And generally speaking, Rabbanim and Bati Din will rule if a woman and her husband are still living in the same house, theoretically they could be having sex. So theoretically, it could be, the product of the marriage. A child could be the product of the marriage, and therefore, since you can't prove otherwise, they're not a mamzer. And DNA testing isn't really accepted halachically for the purposes of mamzers. So it was decided that because I was declared not a mamzer, there were some conditions attached. I would take the surname of my mother's ex-husband, and I would give his name when I was called to the Torah, and halachically I'd be considered a Levi. And to her, that was like a complete violation of her past and herself. To have her remaining son go by the name of the man who had abused her was disgusting to her. But she would hold her tongue when she was on her meds. She'd keep quiet, possibly because she figured my life would be easier the way it was. Off her meds, on the other hand, she would loudly tell the story to anyone who would listen in the interest of telling the truth. so the world would know the real story of how her remaining son came to be. And everybody hated it. I hated it because I didn't want to think of myself as a mamzer and what that meant for my future. My family hated it pretty much for the same reason, but also because they didn't want to think of their daughter or sister as an unfaithful whore. It would not only damage my chances for a shidduch, but what would the neighbors say if they knew? It would ruin the shidduchim of the rest of the family also. I'd hear the same refrain repeated countless times over the years. What would the neighbors say? In each 2-month run-up to every breakdown, she'd obsess over one or several of these narratives and rain accusations down on my grandparents, laying the blame for the way her life turned out squarely at their feet. Almost inevitably, she'd run off with someone and have a fling. Sometimes she'd come home at night, sometimes she didn't. Sometimes she stayed for days at a time. And when she did that, especially after I became old enough to know what was happening and be angry about it, like I was old enough to know that when she stays out, she's probably, having sex with some random guy and, striking up a relationship that's not going to last. And I'd find out who she was with at that time, and I'd call her up, I'd beg her, I'd guilt her, I'd yell at her over the phone to come home. And she'd yell back, and she'd say no, and go away, stop it, and whatever. But eventually she'd come home, but she'd be smelling differently, like cigarettes and whatever, and acting differently than normal. And sometimes she'd become hyper religious, which was weird because when she was level, she wasn't a particularly religious person. Particularly after my grandfather died, she would turn the TV on Shabbos, talk on the phone loudly enough for us to hear on Shabbos. She'd take cabs to her friends on Shabbos. She never went to shul, never participated in Judaism more than she had to. She never covered her hair outside of the house or inside. So I knew to be on guard when she suddenly expressed interest in religion. Her relationship with God wasn't friendly. It tended to be bitter, as if God had so royally screwed her over that God was no longer deserving of the worship that others gave God, which is why she typically observed only the halacha that you pretty much keep by default if you're living in an Orthodox home. Like, you keep Shabbos if the food in the house you keep kosher if the food in the house is kosher. You keep Shabbos, for the most part, if the other people in the house are keeping Shabbos. You'll come to Shabbos meals if they're there. There are things you won't do. You're not going to cook on Shabbos because nobody else is. You don't need to cook because there's already food. So anything that came by default, any observance that came by default, she kept. But she didn't go out of her way, and she didn't inconvenience herself for it. She didn't really care about the religious aspect, and she didn't really care about God, unless she needed something badly enough to try to give God one more chance, which only happened when she was unstable. She knew better when she was stable. She knew better than to try that. But when she was off her meds, she'd angrily give God one more chance to redeem himself. She'd become meticulously observant, hoping that in exchange God would give her first son back or make the court hand custody of me back from my grandmother. And she'd sit in the kitchen and pray every morning, enunciating God's name as it's written in the Siddur, like not Ado. She'd say it as it's spelled out, because that was God's true name. And unless she was being completely honest with God, God wouldn't help her in her mind. God never gave her what she wanted. None of these times. It never worked. It would take her a few days or weeks to realize this, and when she did realize it, she'd be even angrier, more manic, and more unhinged. And these were the overarching themes that she would act out when she became manic. The ones without fail manifested themselves. The ones that without fail she would draw on when she became manic. These themes were always present when she became manic. Blaming the world around her for everything, holding people to account for every slight, whether it was real or imagined, tormenting me with shameful truth about my birth, pining after her other son, and going to court to try to get visitation or custody of him, and battling with God until angrily giving up. But each time was different. I don't remember all of it. I'll try to remember as best as I can for the purposes of this of this narrative. One of the things she tried to do is move out on her own, and she felt that she would be autonomous. She felt that she could be autonomous and didn't want to be under my grandparents' thumb. And it was always a disaster, particularly when she would completely melt down and get evicted by the landlord. But one particular time sticks out in my mind. This happened a bunch of times, but one particular time really sticks out. She had me over at her apartment for Shabbos one time when she was particularly manic, and the whole Shabbos she spent telling me how evil my grandparents were, just telling me all kinds of stuff about my grandparents and really, really trying to make me hate them. And then on Shabbos afternoon, she took me back to my grandparents' home and got into a fight with my grandfather. And I, having just been subjected to 20 hours of nonstop vitriol against my grandfather, mind you, I was like 9 or 10 years old or something, I picked up a knife and I ran at him and tried to stab him. And he grabbed me by the arm, took the knife, took me out of the room, and then he went back and had a nasty fight with my mother, as you would expect. At some point, my mother took me back to her place until after Shabbos. Another time, my mother decided to go on a starvation diet that she read about in the National Enquirer, but she felt she needed a diet partner, to make it easier to share it with. And I was young at the time. I think it was like around the same age, around 9 or 10 years old, maybe 8, maybe, something around that age. But she tried to make me her diet partner. And the diet was something like less than 1,000 calories a day or something crazy like that. And as a kid, I needed more. I mean, even as an adult, 1,000 calories a day is way too little. And every time I tried getting more food, she'd yell at me. And finally, after a few days of this, in addition to all the other garbage that I'd been going through because she was manic and decompensating and losing it, I got sick of it. And I locked myself in the bathroom and refused to come out until she gave me a yogurt. In general, though, she became very snappish and angry and impatient. She'd yell at me constantly, making me feel like shit. Like I was a worthless mistake she made, a fat, good-for-nothing bastard who would never amount to anything, never get married, never mean anything to anyone. And that message stuck with me for a really long time, even though I was reasonably popular in school, had a good number of friends, and I was a pretty good student. And it was so bad that I would hate even saying my own name. I would mumble it out if anyone ever asked. Children are typically given a nickname by their parents when they're young, and then they either grow out of it, they get a new one, or they make it their own. And I had a nickname too, and I hated it, but I never felt assured enough in my own sense of self and self-identity to assert it. I never had the self-esteem to say, I don't want to be called this anymore, I want to be called something else. My own name sounded foreign to me. I never felt secure in the choices I wanted to make for myself, because what did I know? I was just all the things that she called me, like I was all the worthless things that she called me, I didn't, so where do I get off having the agency to make decisions about myself? I didn't feel that I was, worth enough to have agency over my own life. I was just a useless piece of garbage. Identities and self-expression are for people worth existing, and I was told very clearly from a very young age that I wasn't worth existing. And it's taken me a long time to break away from that message, actually. And honestly, dating helped somewhat, because the people who dated me clearly couldn't have hated me that much if they willingly spent that much time with me. But even that wasn't really enough. And I guess I've gotten past it now for the most part. I no longer get repulsed when I look in the mirror. I know my accomplishments. I know the things I've done. And while I try not to shove them in people's faces, I'm capable of listing them when my worth is called into question. I've become proud of the life I've built and the people I have in it, and I'm no longer ashamed of my own name, because I don't associate it with my mother and what I meant to her, or what I didn't mean to her. I associate it with the person I've become and the things I've done with it.